The man named Elias first saw them as silhouettes against a blood-orange dusk, shapes distorted by the heat rising from the plains. There were 6 figures on horseback. 5 of them were slight, huddled into themselves as if to ward off the vast empty sky. The 6th, leading them, sat tall, but it was the rigid posture of a man held together by sheer will. Elias watched from the porch of his cabin, his hand resting on the weathered axe handle leaning against the wall. He recognized the lead rider, Keem, the man whose leg he had splinted just the day before, whose wound he had cleaned with whiskey and packed with yarrow from the creek bed. He had found Keem half-conscious, his horse lame beside him, a raw gash in his thigh telling a story of a fall or a fight. Elias had done what was necessary, the way he did everything, without wasted words or movement. He had hoisted the man onto his own horse, led him back to the cabin, and tended to the wound on the dusty floorboards by the light of a single lantern. They had shared a meal of salted beef and hard bread in near silence, the space between them filled only with the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind. Keem's eyes, dark and deep, had held a universe of pain and a silent, heavy gratitude. When dawn broke, Elias had helped him onto his horse, given him a canteen of water, and watched him ride east until he was just a speck swallowed by the prairie. Now that speck had returned and it had multiplied. Elias didn't move as they approached. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts of the miles they had crossed. Keem halted his horse a dozen yards from the porch. The 5 women behind him stopped in a ragged line, their own mounts tired and lathered. They were not warriors. They were not family come to offer thanks. They were something else entirely. Their clothes were frayed to threads, their hair matted with dirt and leaves. They stared at the ground, at their own hands, at the worn leather of their saddles. Anywhere but at him. They carried a silence that was heavier than the one Elias lived in. His was a quiet of loss and memory. Theirs was a void, a space where something had been violently scooped out. Keem slid from his horse, his movements stiff from the injury. He held up a hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture that asked for pause, for understanding. He spoke, his voice thin against the immensity of the land, the words in his own tongue sharp and sad. Elias didn't understand the language, but he understood the tone. It was the sound of a man giving away the last thing he owned. Keem gestured from the women to Elias, then to the house, his hand open in a plea. This was not a gift. Elias saw it instantly. A gift is given from a place of abundance. This was an act of desperation, a last resort. These women were being shed like a wounded animal sheds its own hide to escape a trap. They were being placed into his care because Keem had nowhere else to turn. He was trusting Elias, the stranger who had shown him a moment of decency, with the lives of 5 broken people. Elias looked past Keem, his eyes moving over the women. They were specters, their faces smudged with exhaustion and something deeper, a terror that had cooled into a permanent frost. One of them, at the end of the line, was thin as a fence rail, her knuckles white where she gripped the frayed rope of her reins. She didn't lift her head, but he could feel the weight of her gaze, a palpable pressure from beneath the curtain of her dark hair. He thought of the cabin behind him, empty except for the ghost of his wife, Sarah. He thought of the long, silent winters and the summers that were just as quiet. His life was a set of routines designed to keep grief at bay. It was a fragile peace, a truce with sorrow. To accept this was to invite the chaos of the world onto his doorstep. It was to take on a responsibility he had never sought. Keem took a halting step forward, his dark eyes locking with Elias's. He said one word that Elias understood. Please. It was a sound that came from under the floorboards of the world, a word stripped of all pride. Elias's gaze drifted to the small, fenced-off square of land on the hill overlooking the cabin, where a simple wooden marker bore Sarah's name. What was decency if it wasn't this? An unwelcome, terrifying, necessary act. He gave a slow, single nod. The tension in Keem's shoulders seemed to dissolve. He turned to the women and spoke softly. They did not react, did not look up. They simply slid from their horses like sacks of grain, their bodies moving with a weary, practiced obedience. Keem led their horses away, tying them to the rail of the corral. Then, without another look at Elias or the women, he mounted his own horse and rode away. He did not look back. He couldn't afford to. 5 women now stood in Elias's yard, adrift in the falling twilight. They remained huddled together, a small island of misery in the vast sea of his land. The wind turned mean, pulling at their thin garments. Elias pushed himself off the porch wall. His movement, small as it was, made them flinch. He didn't speak. Words were useless now. He turned and walked into the cabin, leaving the door open behind him. It was an invitation, nothing more. He moved to the stone hearth, knelt, and added a log to the embers. A shower of sparks danced up the chimney, a brief constellation of light in the growing dark. He filled the kettle with water from the bucket and hung it on the hook over the flames. Actions. Simple, clean, necessary. He waited. The silence from the yard was absolute. He could hear the hiss of the water beginning to warm, the settling groan of the cabin's logs. Then, a shadow fell across the doorway. Then another. One by one, they entered, moving with the quiet, fearful grace of deer entering a hunter's clearing. They didn't look at him. They went to the farthest wall, away from the door, away from him, and sank to the floor. They sat with their knees drawn to their chests, their faces turned to the wall, a tableau of silent suffering. The woman he had noticed outside, the one thin as a rail, was the last to enter. She hesitated at the threshold, her small frame silhouetted against the last of the light. For a moment he thought she might turn and run, back into the swallowing darkness. But she came in, her bare feet making no sound on the wood, and joined the others. Elias poured the hot water into 5 chipped mugs, the steam rising like prayers. He set them on the floor, a careful distance from the women, and then retreated to his own side of the room, sitting in his worn chair by the fire. He didn't lock the door. He never did. He picked up a piece of leather harness he'd been mending and began to work, his hands moving with a slow, steady rhythm. The unspoken contract was laid. Here is warmth. Here is shelter. You are not prisoners. I will not harm you. That night he did not sleep in his bed. He laid a blanket on the floor by the door, his long frame a silent barrier between them and the world outside. He lay awake for hours, listening to the house breathe around its new, wounded heart. He heard one of them cry, a sound so soft it was almost part of the wind. He did not move. He just listened, a sentinel in the dark. The days that followed fell into a strange, new rhythm. Elias rose before the sun, as he always did, and went about his chores. He milked his one cow, mucked out the small barn, checked the fences that stitched his land together. When he returned to the cabin for his breakfast of coffee and cold bread, the women would be huddled in their corner, awake but unmoving. He would leave a portion of food and a pitcher of milk on the table for them and go back outside. They were like ghosts in his house. He would catch glimpses of them through the window, a face peering out, gone as soon as he turned his head. They moved only when he was gone, fetching water, using the outhouse, always moving together in a tight, protective cluster. The food he left was always eaten, the pitcher always empty when he returned at midday. Slowly, a thaw began, started not with a word, but with a broom. He came back from the creek one afternoon to find the cabin's floor swept clean of its perpetual dust. The next day, the dirty mugs were washed and stacked neatly by the water bucket. Small, silent gestures of existence, of a will to do something other than just survive. He acknowledged it in his own way. He started leaving out a larger side of bacon in the mornings. He brought in a sack of flour and one of potatoes from his root cellar and left them on the table. That evening, for the first time, the cabin smelled of something other than wood smoke and old sorrow. It smelled of roasting potatoes. When he came in, a plate with 2 steaming potatoes sat on the small table next to his chair. He ate them, his back to the women. They were a little dry. He didn't complain about them. They were the first meal he hadn't made for himself in 2 years. The focus of his quiet observations began to narrow on one of them, the thinnest one. She had a stillness about her that was different from the others. It was less about fear and more about watching. He saw her from the corner of his eye as he split wood. She would stand in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, and just watch his movements, the swing of the axe, the clean split of the log. Her eyes, which he was beginning to see were the color of dark, wet earth, followed everything. One morning he went to the hill. He did this once a week, a pilgrimage to the grave of his wife. He pulled the few weeds that dared to grow in the hard-packed soil and straightened the simple wooden cross. He stood there for a time, letting the silence and the memories wash over him. As he turned to leave, he saw her, the thin woman. She was standing a respectful distance away, at the bottom of the hill. She wasn't looking at him, but at the grave. When their eyes met, she didn't look away immediately. She held his gaze for a long second before lowering her head and retreating back to the cabin. The next day, when he looked up at the hill from the corral, he saw a tiny speck of color against the brown earth of the grave. He walked up there later. A single, stubborn prairie rose, its pink petals a fragile defiance against the harsh landscape, lay at the base of the cross. He touched one of its soft petals with a calloused finger. A warmth spread through his chest, unfamiliar and unsettling. It felt like the first sun after a long winter, weak but full of promise. He began to leave things for her, indirectly. A bird's feather he found by the creek. A smooth, gray stone from the riverbed. He would place them on the porch rail, and by morning they would be gone. In return, small things would change in the house. A tear in his canvas coat would be mended with neat, small stitches. A loose handle on a pot would be tightened. They were building a language, one made of objects and actions, a conversation held in the spaces between them. A week later, he came inside after a long day of mending a fence line that the wind had turned mean on. He was bone-weary, his hands raw. She was alone by the hearth, stoking the fire. The other women were nowhere to be seen, likely in the small adjoining room he had cleared out for them, the room that had once been Sarah's sewing room. She looked up at him, and for the first time she spoke. Her voice was thin, like dry leaves skittering across the ground. "You are hurt." It wasn't a question. He looked down at his hands. One of his knuckles was split and bleeding. He hadn't even noticed. "It's nothing." She stood and went to the small chest where he kept his supplies. She came back with a clean rag and the jar of salve he made from pine tar and lard. She didn't ask. She simply held out her hand. He hesitated for a heartbeat, his own history of solitude fighting against the gesture. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. Her fingers were surprisingly warm as she took his large, rough hand in hers. She was gentle, her touch as light as a moth's wing as she cleaned the cut and applied the salve. They stood there in the firelight, the silence stretching between them, no longer empty, but filled with the profound intimacy of this simple act of care. He could smell the scent of wood smoke in her hair. He noticed a small, pale scar just above her eyebrow. When she was done, she wrapped the rag around his knuckle. Her eyes met his. "Why?" she whispered. He knew what she was asking. "Why did you take us? Why this kindness?" He thought for a long moment. He could give her a practical answer. That he was lonely. That he needed help. None of it would be the real truth. The truth was heavier and simpler. "Because he asked," Elias said, his voice low and rough, "and because no person should be left to the wolves." A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just nodded, a slow, understanding gesture. It was an answer she understood. She had known the wolves. That night, a storm rolled in, a monster of wind and rain that threw itself against the small cabin. Thunder cracked like the sky splitting open. Elias was woken by a sound from within the house, a choked cry of terror. He lit the lantern. The other women were huddled together, but she was gone from their side. He found her crouched in the darkest corner of the main room, her body trembling violently, her hands pressed over her ears. The sound of the wind, the fury of it, had undone her. He didn't go to her. He knew that would only frighten her more. Instead, he pulled his chair closer to the fire, stoking it until it blazed bright, pushing back the shadows. He sat down and simply stayed there, a silent, unmoving guardian against the storm and the memories it carried. "You're safe here," he said into the roaring dark. "The storm will pass." He spoke of simple things, of how the rain was good for the dry earth, of how the lightning, for all its noise, rarely struck the same place twice. He didn't know if she was listening, but his voice was a steady anchor in the tumult. After a long while, the trembling subsided. He saw her, in the flickering light, slowly uncurl herself from the tight knot of fear. She didn't return to the others. She stayed in her corner, her eyes on the fire, and watched the storm with him until it blew itself out and a bruised dawn broke over the drenched land. The foundation of trust, laid with gestures and silence, had now been set in the stone of a shared vigil. Life settled into a new kind of normal. The other four women, seeing the safety of this place, began to show sparks of their former selves. One began to hum as she worked in the small garden they had planted. Another proved to have a deft hand at baking, turning Elias's flour and potatoes into loaves of dense, satisfying bread. He once tried to make a loaf himself, and the woman, seeing the charred, rock-hard result, had simply shaken her head, a ghost of a smile on her lips. She had taken the loaf from him and thrown it to the chickens. "That loaf died in vain," she'd said, her first full sentence, and a ripple of soft laughter had gone through the women. It was a sound Elias hadn't heard in his home for years. But his connection remained strongest with the thin one. She still rarely spoke, but her silence was now a comfortable one. They worked together, mending a section of the corral, her small hands surprisingly strong as she held the posts steady for him. They moved in an easy orbit around each other, a partnership that needed no words to define it. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sky faded to purple, she looked at him. "You are either the kindest man I have ever met," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "or the most foolish." A rare, dry smile touched Elias's lips. "Can't I be both?" She considered this, then gave a small nod. "Perhaps that is what kindness is." The peace, of course, was never meant to last. It was a fragile bubble in a world full of sharp edges. The harbinger came in the form of 3 riders on the horizon, their shapes black against the setting sun. They were not wandering cowboys or lost travelers. They rode with a purpose that made the air grow cold. Elias saw them first. He was coming back from the creek, and he stopped dead, the water bucket slipping from his hand. The woman, he still didn't know her name, was on the porch, shaking out a blanket. She saw the look on his face and followed his gaze to the horizon. All the color drained from her face. The blanket fell from her hands, landing in the dust. The other women, drawn by the sudden, terrible silence, came to the door. A collective gasp, sharp and fearful, cut the air. They knew who it was. Elias moved without thinking. He strode to the cabin, took the heavy rifle from its pegs over the door, and checked the load. He turned to the women. "Inside. Bar the door. Stay away from the windows." They scrambled inside, their brief season of peace shattered. But as he turned back to face the approaching riders, he felt a presence at his side. It was her. She hadn't gone in. She was holding a heavy piece of firewood, her knuckles white around the wood. Her face was a mask of terror, but her feet were planted firm. "I will not hide," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. He looked at her, at the fierce, desperate courage in her eyes, and he knew he couldn't send her away. He gave a short, sharp nod. "Stay behind me." The riders pulled up just beyond the fence line. The man in the middle was thick-set and florid, with a cruel twist to his mouth. Silas Kane, a man who bought and sold land and sometimes people. He was the wolf. "Elias?" Kane called out, his voice slick with false familiarity. "Heard you were keeping some lost property of mine." His eyes slid past Elias to the woman, a greasy, possessive look that made Elias's hand tighten on his rifle. "They're not property," Elias said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. And they're not lost. This is their home. Cain laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. Home? This dirt patch. Don't be a fool. The law is on my side. That one, he pointed a thick finger at the woman, was promised to me. A business arrangement. She ran before the deal was done. I've come to collect what's mine. She is not a sack of grain, Cain, Elias said, taking a step forward. He didn't raise the rifle, just held it loosely at his side. It was threat enough. She is a person, and she is under my protection. You are not welcome on this land. Leave. Protection. Cain sneered, his face turning red. You, an old widower playing hero to some squaw? Don't make me laugh. He started to swing his leg over his saddle. I'm taking what's mine. It happened fast. As Cain's boot hit the ground, the woman stepped out from behind Elias. She moved with a speed he didn't know she possessed. She didn't use the piece of wood as a weapon. She dropped it, and with a cry that was torn from the very depths of her soul, a sound of rage and pain and liberation, she slapped Silas Cain across the face. The crack of her hand against his skin echoed in the sudden, stunned silence. Cain froze, his hand flying to his cheek, his eyes wide with disbelief. His men shuffled their horses, unsure. No one had expected this. They had expected a cowering, broken thing. They were not prepared for this blaze of defiance. She stood before him, trembling from head to toe, but her eyes were twin flames. No, she said, the word a hammer blow. I am not yours. I am not a promise. I am not a thing. That was when the door of the cabin opened. The other 4 women stepped out onto the porch. One held a cast iron skillet, another a fireplace poker. They said nothing. They just stood there, a silent, unmovable wall of solidarity. Cain looked from the woman's furious face, to Elias's cold eyes, to the rifle at his side, to the 4 women on the porch. He was a bully, and the core of every bully is a coward. He saw that there would be a fight here, a bloody, ugly fight he might not win. And for what? For his pride. It wasn't worth the risk. He spat on the ground. This isn't over, he snarled, but the threat was hollow. He hauled himself back onto his horse, shot one last look of pure hatred at the woman, and wheeled his mount around. He and his men galloped away, their retreat kicking up a cloud of angry dust that soon settled, leaving only silence in its wake. On the porch, the air was thick with the aftermath. The woman stood, her body still shaking with adrenaline. Elias stepped up beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. Their shoulders were inches apart, and it was enough. You didn't run, he said, his voice quiet with something that sounded like awe. She looked at him, and for the first time, a true, real smile touched her lips. It was a watery, shaky thing, but it transformed her face. You didn't either. In the weeks that followed, the world righted itself on a new axis. The danger had passed, but the confrontation had changed everything. A few days later, the other 4 women came to him. The one who baked bread spoke for them. They were leaving. They had relatives 2 territories over, a place they could be safe. They had seen what courage looked like, and they were ready to find their own way. They thanked him, their gratitude deep and sincere. Elias gave them supplies for their journey, and his best horse. He and the woman stood on the porch and watched them ride west, until they were specks disappearing into the horizon. The cabin felt vast and empty again, but it was a different kind of emptiness now. It was a space waiting to be filled. That evening, they sat by the fire, the silence comfortable and deep. I never asked your name, Elias said. She looked into the flames. I had a name once. It was taken from me. I have not used it in a long time, she took a breath. It is Lena. He let the name settle in the quiet room. Lena, he said, tasting the sound of it. It's a good name. It suits you. She looked at him, her eyes clear. Thank you for giving it back to me. The next morning, Lena went into the small room that had been their sanctuary. She carefully gathered the last few things that had belonged to Sarah. A small lace collar, a book of pressed flowers, and placed them in a wooden box. She didn't hide it away. She placed it on the mantelpiece, an act not of replacement, but of honor. Then she took the tattered, filthy dress she had arrived in, the one she had kept folded in a corner, and she took it to the fire. She fed it to the flames and watched until it was nothing but gray ash. Elias, watching from the doorway, understood. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. He walked outside and began to rebuild the section of corral fence that had been rotting for years, his movements sure and strong. He was no longer just mending, he was building. The seasons turned. The harsh winter gave way to a green spring, and the prairie bloomed with defiant color. The house was no longer a hollow place of memory, but a home. It breathed with the rhythm of their shared lives, the scent of Lena's baking, the sound of their quiet footsteps on the floorboards. Their life was a tapestry woven with threads of shared work, comfortable silence, and a deep, unspoken understanding that had grown in the space between two wounded souls. One evening, they sat on the porch steps, watching the stars prick the vast, dark canopy of the sky. Lena leaned her head, just for a moment, against his shoulder. It was a gesture of profound trust, of arrival. Elias didn't stiffen. He didn't move at all. He just sat there, a bulwark of quiet strength, and felt the warmth of her presence beside him. The land was still harsh, the world still full of wolves, but here, on this small patch of earth, they had built a sanctuary. They had found not a truce with sorrow, but a lasting peace. This story, it ain't just about a rescue or a gift given in desperation. It's about how sometimes the only way to heal your own broken places is to offer shelter to someone else's. It's about how real strength ain't in the fist, but in the open hand. It's about the quiet courage it takes to stand your ground, not just against the canes of the world, but against the ghosts inside your own house. We all carry these ghosts, these old names, these tattered clothes from a life that hurt us. And we all search for a place safe enough to finally burn them. So here's your naming. A reminder that your worth ain't something that can be given or taken by another. It's the land you stand on. And if you're brave enough to defend it, you might just find that you haven't built a fortress but a home.